Continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Gretchen Beilfuss Witt. Gretchen was born in, I hope I'm not going to mispronounce this, Valparaiso, which is located in northwestern Indiana. She was educated at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, where she received a Bachelor of Arts degree, having studied history and religion. She attended the, and hope I'm not going to pronounce this, Catawba, thank you, College in Salisbury, North Carolina, earning her middle school social studies teaching certificate and received her master's degree in library science from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She is currently the history room librarian and supervisor of the Edith M. Clark History Room of Rowan Public Library, helping to preserve and share the history of Greater Rowan County, as well as helping people all over the country trace their family history. Working with Genealogical Society of Rowan County, she has been presenting classes on genealogical topics for the past few years. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gretchen.
Well, thank you very much. I almost said, well, I can say good morning to you, even though it's afternoon for me. But good morning. Glad to be here. So Western North Carolina is pretty much, Western North Carolina genealogy is pretty much what I do almost all the time. So, but I'm going to be happy to tell you about that. So in the about the mid-1700s, Rowan County was the western frontier of the colonies. This was the Wild, Wild West. The courthouse at Salisbury was the furthest west at that time. Rowan County covered a huge area of land. Our current southern border and with Cabarrus, north to Virginia, and then west to the Mississippi River. So essentially, we covered what is now the western quarter of North Carolina and the top half of Tennessee. We're all part of Rowan County. And for nearly the first 20 years of its existence, it covered that area. Approximately 37 other counties were eventually carved out of what was Rowan County. We had many immigrants that came through this area. Some of them from the East Coast, of North or South Carolina, Charleston particularly, but the majority of them came down the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road and from Philadelphia through the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia and then down through North Carolina. The terminus was in Augusta, Georgia, but a lot of people stopped in what is now Winston-Salem, and also but at the time, Salisbury was the largest of the towns to come to in what is called the Piedmont area. This area began to be settled in the 1740s, and by 1753, it had gained enough numbers in order to be, they formed a new county. They petitioned to have a new county. But as you can see from this map, that the one line as it goes into Tennessee, pretty much, continues on to the Mississippi River. But this is what it looked like a little bit after 1753. What's on the map, what is Orange County, was about 2/3 of that was still Rowan County. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about all the records that can help you with your genealogy families, what we have and don't have. Of course, vital records. Everybody starts out with vital records. We do not, in North Carolina, of those of you who might be from the West, and I know some of the states in the Midwest started recording births and deaths even in the 1800s, and some places in New England even recorded them much earlier than that. However, in North Carolina, birth and death records were only required to be kept in 1913. So 1913. So, and between 1913 and 1930, not everybody was completely compliant with that. But we do have marriage records stretching back to the 1600s. So as early as 1669, we have a law of allowing people. Now, if you'll remember, at this point in time, the colony of North Carolina was part of the British Empire, and so the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, what's now the Episcopal Church, was the church of the land. Everybody had to belong to that. So, but we didn't have very many clergy here, so they couldn't marry anyone who wanted to be married. So they did enact a law that allowed a couple to bring a couple friends and come before the governor or the council, the General Assembly, and get married. Now, by 1766, you have marriages that could be performed by the dissenters. Basically, that means the Quakers, or the Presbyterian clergy. This area was largely settled by the Scots-Irish, and many of them, like 90% of them, would have been Presbyterian. So that was an important law for this area. And then by 1776, an ordinance was passed and became a law 2 years later, that every regular minister of any denomination that had the cure of souls, so it couldn't be just a preacher, but it had to be someone who was ordained and a pastor of a particular church, could marry. But also there could be the justices of the peace, and could also perform marriages. Now, what interesting thing about this is you didn't have to have any civil record of your marriage. So there are lots and lots of people that didn't have any kind of record of a marriage. There are lots of other ways to look for them. But between say 1741 and 1868, a lot of people, if there's some civil evidence of their marriage, it's a marriage bond. So this is basically what a bond looks like. If any of you, I don't know if you can read it, but essentially this tells us that James McCabe intends to marry Annie Woodsides. Now, there's a date on this document, but that doesn't mean that's the date they actually got married. It's the date they took out the bond, that the groom took out the bond. Unfortunately, it also doesn't tell you who their parents were, what their age was, or any of those fun things that we look for now. But it does tell you that in August, of the 15th day of August in 1826, his intention was to marry Annie Woodsides. He has a bondsman whose name is Archibald Woodsides, and we would make the assumption that Archibald is somehow related to Annie. Could be a brother, an uncle, or father, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about their relationship. So, but it still does, give us the, names at least, and a confirmation that they intended to get married. Now, the one thing about bonds is that they have to pledge a certain amount of money. In this case, it was £500, which was a huge amount of money in 1826. And later on, they have to pledge up to £1,000. But that doesn't mean they actually paid that in order to get married. What it meant was that they were promising that there was no impediment to their marriage. So they weren't, bigamists, or there wasn't some other reason why they couldn't get married. If they later discovered there was a reason, then they would have to, then the bond would be dissolved, and or the marriage would be dissolved, and then they would have to pay this money. But fortunately, that wasn't the case most of the time. Now, we also have sometimes, very, very occasionally, you have a father's permission. So sometimes when a daughter is underage, or I actually have seen mother's permissions too. If the person, the groom or the bride, but typically more often the bride, was underage, then they would have to have permission to get married. And sometimes these are recorded, or we still have evidence. And this one is from 1768, which is a pretty early one. Another stipulation of the marriage records, which can be useful to us, is the minister's return. So the person who actually married them then was supposed to send in a confirmation that they had in fact performed the marriage ceremony. And this is actually the few records that we have that would be that would confirm the actual date of the marriage. So this one is from Rowan County, and confirmed that the bond was taken out on the 21st of June, and they married on the 22nd of June. So you can, we can actually be certain that the marriage took place. This was a handwritten. A lot of times you'll see these handwritten ones too. So those kinds of records will be helpful, partially because it sometimes confirms the marriage itself or possibly other participants in the family and that kind of thing. And we also, at least in Rowan County and in some other places in North Carolina, we're lucky enough to have some pastors' records. And so one of our pastors in this area kept a diary for, as you can see, some almost 60 years worth of church records. So it's very helpful and confirms a lot of things. So went to Widow Edelman's and married Wilson Lentz to Polly Edelman. So in 1846, we know that happened as well. And now in 1851, we do have what starts to be marriage licenses. However, they are still not required. The marriage records or marriage licenses are not actually required in North Carolina until 1868. With the new constitution that we have here, but you get more and more information. So the marriage licenses here in 1851 will tell you a little bit. They start to include a little bit more information. They start to include the information of the father and mother's names of both the bride and the groom, how old the bride and groom are, and whether or not their parents are alive or dead at the time, which can really be helpful for you if you're looking for parents and confirm whether they where they might have lived, where they might have died or when they might have died. And we also have some of these Rowan. This is a Rowan marriage register, but there are several other counties that kept a register like this, and so it will tell you. Sometimes it will tell you other information about the person, and if they It'll tell you whether they got married in the Justice of the Peace office, because they'll give you the Justice of the Peace, or if they were married by a pastor. Now, a lot of times, of course, they weren't actually married in a church. They might have been married by a pastor in a house. But it does tell you, if there's a Justice of the Peace or a reverend. Now, one of the interesting things, and this is particularly helpful if you are doing any kind of African American research, a cohabitation bond, and I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this. Some places in the Southeast have cohabitation bonds, but after the Civil War, folks were given the opportunity to declare their marriages as I don't know if you do know this. Of course, in what was the Confederacy, most states banned marriages between slaves, technically, but a lot of folks lived together as man and wife, and so with the cohabitation bond, they could go to the county courthouse, declare that they had been living as married from such and such a date, and you can see from this document that since December of 1855, this couple had considered themselves married. And so they were declared married and their children legitimized and all that kind of stuff. So it was very helpful. But what is also helpful for further research is they will most of the time tell you who the slaveholder of a particular person was if they were in fact a slave. So Samuel Steele, late a slave of the Reverend Thomas Houghton, and Henrietta Henderson, late a slave of Archibald Henderson, were married, and but that might help you to track their family, because then you will know what family to look for other records. Now, this is another cohabitation bond, and it declares the gentleman, Alfred Love, was late a slave of Charles Mackenzie, but Lucy Heikman was a free woman, and it tells you here. So it can get the cohabitation bonds, not only can confirm a marriage and but also give you some additional information and clues that would be helpful for the rest of your tracking the particular family. Now, of course, when there's marriage, there's divorce, but not very often. And in North Carolina, very early on in colonial times, only the assembly could only order an absolute divorce if it had passed through the ecclesiastical court or the church court first. And of course, they didn't really have them in the ecclesiastical court in the colonies. So basically, under English law, you couldn't have an absolute divorce. You could only get a divorce from bed and board. So it was basically a legal separation. But and most of these divorces had to go in front of the General Assembly, and actually a law passed to allow people to be separated or divorced. Now, after the Revolution, then after the Revolutionary War, then that power to dissolve or separate a marriage is shared by superior courts, and then after 1835, the superior court holds the sole jurisdiction. But here, there is a book that I have available, and is a relatively new book, but it is Divorces and Separation Petitions in the North Carolina General Assembly. And it can give you all kinds of interesting information about the family that you're looking for. As you can see, Hannah and her husband, George deserted her and leaving her without support, but he kept on sending creditors her way. And so she asked for, and was granted, a petition to be separated from him so he couldn't continue to take basically his creditors take all her money. As I said before, birth records there in 1913 was the earliest that we have birth records, or basically birth certificates. So we want to, but there are, of course, other ways to find out when people were born. You've got Bible records, and I'm just going to show you some examples of some of these records. So here's a Bible record that we have in our collection from the Snyder Bible, even though it's mostly the name that you see is Went, but it was actually the Snyders that gave us the Bible. North Carolina, the North Carolina Archives, and this is a link that's on your handout, has a family records collection. And as you can see on the far left, Bible records. So you can look at these records online and search them and see if any of your family might be here. And even if you don't know whether or not you have any North Carolina families, these Bible records were sent to the North Carolina Archives from all over the country. So if they have any kind of North Carolina connections, but they might have other connections as well. So they're worth a look at just to see if your family might be included in these archives. And they continue to accept Bible records for this collection. Of course, church records. In this area, the two primary church bodies early on, particularly, are as I said before, the Presbyterians, and also the Lutherans or the German Reformed. And very early, the Pilgrim Church was part of what is now Davie County in North Carolina, but which is adjacent to Rowan and was part of Rowan for a good long time. One of the handy things about this is it's the father of the, and this is a transcription because I didn't think any of you'd want to read the German script. But Peter Everhart, and he gives, the father gives the names and baptisms and that kind of thing for all of his children. So this can be very helpful when you're trying to connect families from very early on. Oregon Lutheran Church is another church that's in this area, and I didn't include the German script this time, but as you can see, it tells you not only the baptismal date, but also the birth dates and who their parents were and godparents or sponsors. So this is a very important record for us. It's probably the earliest these are the earliest church records we have are from Oregon Lutheran Church, and they date from essentially 1788 on up. One of the other ways to find out when people were born is if there were any apprenticeship bonds. So this is the court record here. ordering that Rebecca Williams, an orphan of the James Williams deceased of the age of 3.5, is bound, and bound just means that she's, his responsibility until she gets to be 18 years old. And, but since we know when this court date was, then we can figure out how old she is and look in 18 years to see when she's released. And under this is another orphan, her brother, who was orphan, also an orphan of James Williams, and he is 8 years old, and he's bound in order to the age of 21 rather than 18 to learn the weaver's trade. So this can help you out not only for the age, but also occupation and where you might be able to find other information about these folks. Of course, there's also bastardy bonds. I don't know how many of you may have heard this, but about bastardy bonds, the county court did not want to have to end up paying to have children supported if their fathers weren't around. And of course, women didn't have very many ways of supporting themselves. So we have here just an example of ordered by the court that a mulatto female child, and we don't know her name, and we don't really know, we know her mother's name, but don't know her father's name at this point. But she has to be bound out until she's 31, which seems like a long time when you're only one year and 3 months old. But bastardy bonds take a couple different forms, and they were done from the 1700s on up through the 1800s. So it can be a handy if you're not sure, can't find a father's name, or you're not sure how how the family line goes. These can be very useful. We also in North Carolina have delayed birth records. So if you do in fact have someone who was born before 1913, but had to apply for, say, a passport at some point or another, they would have needed to declare their birth, and they had to come to the courthouse, and their parents had to say how old they were. If they had a Bible record, they would bring that, or if they had their school records, because kids started school about 6 or 7 years old at that point in time, and could at least give you a ballpark. But these were particularly important later on then for Social Security and also for passports and the like. So even if your folks were born before the 1913 date, we might have a record for them because they did go back and do the delayed birth records. Death records, again, not till 1913. Sometimes the best record you've got is the actual tombstone. Now, if you've been doing genealogy for any length of time, sometimes mistakes get made even on tombstones, but it might give you the best idea. And sometimes you have to figure things out. So here is a Presbyterian tombstone in an adjacent county, not in Rowan at the moment, but his name was Richard Berry, and he died August 21st, 1801, in the 75th year of his life. So you can figure out when he was born. Of course, then we do have death certificates, and this is basically what a death certificate looks like in early on in North. This is a 1967 in North Carolina, pretty much the same as most other people's. Now we do also have court records. Now these will usually give you an idea around when they passed away, not necessarily a day or date or specific date, but that if letters of administration were ordered that someone had passed away since the last court had been held. And so you can kind of at least narrow it down, usually in a 3-month time frame. And of course, wills. Again, wills don't tell you usually when they died. They just give you an idea of when the will was written. and then usually when it was probated. But again, gives you an idea of what you can expect. Now this record was probated in 1845, and it's interesting. It was mostly an inventory. There were like 5 pages of inventory, but probate can also include guardianship bonds or apprentice bonds or anything that has to do with the death of a person. And in fact, some of our probate records can go for years and years after the person actually died. So like if you died in 1845 and you had a son that was 2 years old and he inherited everything, then he's not going to be able to own that land free and clear until he's 21. So it'll be 19 years later that you'll actually have the probate finally closed. So if anyone has any questions, please write them down. I'm going to continue to go on, but that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you about vital records. And now we'll go on to land or property records. Our land records typically, I usually have to explain this, so I'm going to go ahead and explain this. That a lot of people come in here and they say, oh, well, my family received a grant, so they were given this land. And a grant does not mean that somebody nicely gave you land. It means that you were the first person to own the land. And so if it was the crown or the state or a big landowner that was gifted a lot of land, then that's a grant. So the first person to own it was given a grant. But then 20 years later, if you sell it to your neighbor, then that transfer is a deed. So the grant indicates the government or a proprietor, and we have several large landowners here in North Carolina in this area that I'll talk to you about in just a minute. But the price of the land could include the cost per acre. That's what usually it's stated, but actually could include some other fees like a quit rent and other upfront fees. Sometimes minerals are involved and those kinds of things. A warrant is also something that sometimes people are confused by. A warrant just means that you've requested this particular piece of land and you have been given the right to have the land identified and surveyed. Now, one of the interesting things about North Carolina is that in most of the rest of the United States, that was eventually federal land, but outside of the Southeast, the land is divided up into, squares, basically into squares. And but in the Southeast, including North Carolina, we have a different land identifying system. Basically, it's called meets and bounds. So basically, you have a description of what the land looks like. So basically, you had somebody come out into the backcountry, look at a piece of land, and they go, oh, I like that hill. We could have a nice house there, and there's a brook going by not too far away, and that kind of thing. And they decided that that was the piece of land that they wanted, and then they would have it surveyed. And rather than buying, the southeast quadrant of the, huge square in Nebraska kind of thing. I want to get to an example. This is an original indenture, but this is the kind of call signs where how the land is described. So you have have things like the land starts on the east side of Reed's Branch, running thence north 20 and then east 160 poles to a white oak sapling, and then hence north 70 degrees to 79 poles, crossing the branch. And, so basically, and it goes to the hickory, the hickory tree, and then the black oak, and then you have so many rods and poles to another adjacent property. But you get the idea. It's not, so if someone asks you where their land was, it's much more difficult to answer that question than it would be if, it was the southeast corner of 640 acres, which is how the federal land was divided up later on. I hope that's not confusing. One of the things too about how land is described, a lot of times it just gives a waterway, a brook, a river, a branch, those kinds of things. It doesn't mean actually that the land was actually on that water. It just means it was in its drainage area. So it gives you, at least it does give you a general idea of where the land was. In Rowan County, one of the important people to know about is the Earl of Granville. In the 1600s, King Charles of England granted a charter to 8 lords proprietors, and he gave them the land basically that was the Carolinas. And long story short, over the years, this was inherited by various heirs and different lords, and there were, people tried to sell it and those kinds of things. And eventually, the king asked for the land back. But one of the lords, John Carteret, who was the first Earl of Granville, chooses not to sell his land back to the king or to the crown, but he wants all that land, and he's given that land. And so a lot of times in North Carolina, you will see the term Granville Grant. So Granville was the one who owned this land initially. He was given it from the king, and he never was here in the colonies or the United States, but he appointed land agents to live here and to sell off his land, parts of the huge area that he had, most of which was in Rowan, or a lot of which was in what was that larger area of Rowan County. In fact, our southern border was the end of his apportionment, was the southern part of his apportionment. So it's important to see, when you see Granville grants, that's who that was. The selling agent was Lord Granville. Fortunately, we do not have to read. A lot of our land records have been transcribed either by Mrs. McCubbins, who was a Salisburian, Mrs. Lynn, who was a noted genealogist for many years, and also Mr. Klutz abstracted many of our property records. And our Mrs. McCubbins typed or wrote a great many of them, and we have those in our collection. And actually, I apologize, this is a link I forgot to include in the links, but Mrs. McCubbins' surname folders, which include a lot of land records like this, are on our website with free access to anybody who would like to look. So it's Rowan Public Library, and the McCubbins Index would get you to the information that you would like. But it does help a great deal to go in and not have to read the script for the land records. But you can see how you have this is 152 acres on the north waters of Beaver Creek, beginning at the original corner of John Carr at a post oak. But that's not going to help you, 50 years later when John doesn't own that land anymore. So that can be very confusing. Um, Also in our land records can also tell you a great deal about what's going on in a particular family or give you some other hints. These are property. They're not just, we call them land records, but they're not just land. Their deed books also include mortgages and other property transactions. So particularly in any antebellum deed books, there can also be very useful for finding anyone who was formerly enslaved and maybe tracing their family backwards through property records. And you can also sometimes see what people owned and therefore maybe what they farmed or what their occupation was because of what they were selling or what they had to mortgage and that kind of thing. So these property records can be extremely helpful. We do have our property deed books transcribed from 1753 up to 1853, and this particular record is from an unpublished book that goes up a little further to the 1858, I believe. One of the other websites that I'd like you to know about is if your family has some land or had some land in North Carolina, this is a free website. He got his information from the North Carolina Archives. It's called NorthCarolinaLandGrants.com. And I would absolutely say to definitely take a look at it. It's very helpful. However, sometimes if you have a particularly strong firewall with your computer, it is sometimes difficult to get into security. I've never had any trouble with it being a problem, but sometimes it's hard to get into. Or like I said, if your firewall makes it difficult for you to go to sites that are potentially not secure, but it is a good website to look. These are just, this is just a search that I started, and you can just you can put in as much information as you know or as little. So all I did was put in a last name, and it shows you where the locations are, the counties, the acreage, what the years were. So it can give you a lot of helpful information. Many of our registers of deeds in North Carolina, they all retain the old land records and the old marriage records. So one of the things that you can look at is many of them have historical record searches. This is actually Rowan County Register of Deeds, and you can look in the historical record search. I'll show you what that looks like if you go to the Register of Deeds, and that link is included. And if you look at the tabs, if you come all the way over to where that green arrow is, the historical record search, that you can look for grantors and grantees for any of the land records up to a certain point. They have much of the earlier ones loaded, but not completely up to the present day. But anyway, if you have some older 1700s to up to mid 1800s, you should be able to find them here on this site. Now, when we have land, we also have taxes. So taxes are another good way to track people in North Carolina. We don't really have a state census in North Carolina. So a tax record is the best that you can usually do from the 1700s on up to the 1600s up to 1790 when the first federal census is taken. So the poll taxes and then later land taxes and property taxes can be very helpful. First of all, it tells you when people appeared in a certain area if they're paying a poll tax. And for most of the time, you can see if someone had or was a certain age. You were taxed if you were 16 years or older, if you're a white male. If you were a slave of any gender, they started counting you as taxable when you were 12. One of the things that did also made a difference with taxes is the state was divided into military districts, and so had militia captains, and in a lot of areas the taxes were collected by the militia captains and reported that way. So you can this is a tax list from what was Rowan County at the time, which is 1772, but eventually becomes Iredell County, the Iredell County area. And you can see that this particular tax list in 1772 could give you some additional information about a person. Sometimes when you're trying to connect a child with or a son with a father, these can be helpful. So we know, for instance, about a few down, Joseph Galley and his son James were both, so James is over 16. So that's helpful to know that. We believe in this, it will also potentially tell you how many slaves that they were paying poll taxes on, as well as sons. So, as far as I know, in North Carolina, no white women are ever taxed in this from basically the 1700s up to the 1900s. So you can, those kinds of things will also give you information. This tax list is from the book by Joe Whitelin, The Rowan County, North Carolina Tax List, 1757 to 1800. It's annotated transcriptions, and it is a wonderful book, and we help out a lot of people to tell them yes or no, your person or your family was here at this time, and it shows a lot of times when they first show up in Rowan, even before they're able to afford land to purchase. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about court records, although I've shown you some other court records at this point too. This link is also on your list of links. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has some of their archives and manuscript collections have included a lot of things that go onto their website, but documenting the American South is one of their collections, and the Colonial and State Records of North Carolina. I have of course, the paper copy, but since you are in Nevada or places far away, you can still look at this information at this website, and it can tell you, when your folks might be in particular areas of North Carolina. So it's can be a very helpful document. The courts in North Carolina were held on a quarterly basis, hence quarter sessions. So for about a week or so, for as long as it took to take care of business, every 3 months, the minutes will show you what county it is, what month and year. A lot of times, the very early, particularly right after the Revolution, it will tell you in what year, the 7th year after the formation of the country, you had to have at least 3 justices of the peace in order to conduct court, but sometimes 5 or more are listed, but you had to have 3 in order to conduct the court. The Court of Pleas and quarter sessions included both civil and criminal court concerns, but you also get all kinds of other interesting information. So appointments of officers, a lot of times you'll have juries that are appointed, the registers of deeds, the sheriffs, constables, and the road overseers. So anybody who helped with the road, or those kinds of things. Apprentice bonds, the bastardy bonds, which we've already talked about. Anytime you purchased land, it had to be proved in court. So you'll have a list of all the things that were, all the land that was land and bills of sale that were proved in court. Anytime someone died, or a man died and he had property, his wife was given a certain amount of money and for upkeep for her and her children until the estate was settled, and this can be seen in the court records as well. This is basically a really nice and fairly legible. I have to tell you, I read a lot of stuff that's much less legible than this, but very pretty handwriting. But February 10th of 1775 is when this court, and it tells you that there was a guardian, some orphans that were ordered bound out, and a couple bastardy bonds and a guardianship bond, and the inventory of an estate. So a lot of times they might be one day of the week where they handled any a particular type of business. So all the land records might have been handled in one day, and all of the anything that had to do with someone's death, so estates, inventories, guardianship bonds, those kinds of things all might have been handled on the same day. But there isn't always a specific structure to how they did court. Another great way to see to find people in North Carolina would be to check military histories. We also have in North Carolina, as it was in a lot of the colonies, you had to have militia was required, and so even by the 1660s, people were required to have their own musket, their powder, and shot in order to claim land grants. And they had they mustered a group of people, so they had to train bands and companies of soldiers. And basically, though, the militia was called up when something was happening. They didn't just go into service. That usually was to treat a specific threat. The militia districts, as you saw, and the tax districts were the same. So your militia captain, again, was the same as the fellow who collected the tax, and was usually elected by the group of men. So the captain was, or sometimes appointed by the court. Usually the service was a 3-month service. It could be much less than that. Sometimes you'll see it was 3 days, and they took care of the problem in 3 days, and they were done. You were eligible for service for the time you were 16 up until the time you were 60. So any white males were eligible for service. These are some of the reasons why they had some of the militia called up. So the Tuscarora wars with the Tuscarora Indians. Sometimes the French and Indian War was one that had to be paid for. And in North Carolina, there's a war called the War of Regulation, or the Regulators' War, and that's kind of an interesting part of North Carolina history if you don't know about it. It was kind of a precursor to the Revolution. People who were unhappy with how they felt like they were being overcharged for petitions for marriage bonds or land petitions and those kinds of things, and they revolted and requested. But that would be one of the wars that people were called up for the militia. I think a lot of people may not realize that the North Carolina, North Carolina owned what is now Tennessee, was part of their land, and during the Revolution, a lot of the land that was in Tennessee was actually was then later treated as bounty land for Revolutionary War service. So North Carolina, a lot of people from North Carolina moved into Tennessee even before the war, but particularly after the war, to claim their bounty lands. So those lands that were given to them for their service in the wars. So bounty lands are often a great way to figure out why somebody moved from North Carolina, say, to Tennessee, or why they moved from Virginia to end up in Kentucky. Those kinds of things. It may have been because of bounty lands. This particular database is in Ancestry, which probably a lot of you have at least access to if you don't subscribe to it. But there are the North Carolina and Tennessee Revolutionary War land warrants. But that's why why North Carolina and Tennessee are connected in that way, because a lot of the state of Tennessee, people from North Carolina were given the bounty lands from there. You can also get to these early North Carolina, Tennessee land grants at the State Archives of Tennessee, which is this link is included there. So if your family ended up in Tennessee, but you know they came from North Carolina, this might help you track those folks and why they got where they got. Also, the War of 1812, the North Carolina State Library has digital collections, and they have all the pay vouchers for the War of 1812. Now, the North Carolina militia and regular soldiers that went to the War of 1812 weren't very many of them, but there were still, it's good to have the records for them being available. A lot of people come to the Rowan Public Library to look at the history room collection for Civil War information. We have all this North Carolina Civil War service records. We have them from the Confederate North Carolina soldiers and also the North Carolina Union soldiers. So the service records used to only be available at the archives or the North Carolina archives. I should be more clear, the North Carolina archives. But also, we also have a set of the microfilm for all of North Carolina here, and that was, for a long time, that was very helpful for anybody coming into North Carolina from the western part of North Carolina. It was much closer here than to go to Raleigh. A lot of these records, of course, are now available on Fold 3 or some other websites, but we do have, but we still see a lot of good use of the Civil War records here. In case you're not familiar with them, the first card will tell you what company they were in, what regiment, and the number of cards. So this is just one of the cards that shows up in this private's collection. There were 18 or 19 other cards, so he had a pretty lengthy recording of his service, so you might be able to find a good bit about him. Other documents that can be found is when after the war ended. This is dated in Salisbury in June of 1865, and this person is returning to Rowan County and swearing or giving the oath of allegiance that they won't be rise up against the Constitution of the United States again. So we have some records of those. The Civil War also generated some pensions, both widows and soldiers' pensions. But what's interesting and to know is that, of course, the Confederate pensions from the Civil War are not federally funded, because that would be funding the enemy, basically. But a lot of the states in the South allowed for pensions for soldiers who had fought in the Confederacy. So these are state records, and so individual states may have different rules and time frames that they paid pensions. But in North Carolina, the first round of pensions was possible in 1885 and then in 1901. So here's and you could petition as a widow of a soldier or as a soldier, and in some cases as underage children could possibly apply as well. But this is the 1885, an example of the 1885 widow's pension, and it does tell but it's, recorded under the soldier, and it depends on where he was enlisted, and talks about his company and regiment and that sort of thing. So you can find out more about him. Here is the pensions, an example of a pension in 1901. Along with the application for admission to North Carolina Soldiers Home. But it's interesting to note, while you wouldn't find these in the federal archives, you find them in different state archives for the Confederate. Also, North Carolina has a collection of World War I cards that give you the information about soldiers and also nurses that were in World War I. This person happens to be from the town of Salisbury and ended up being trained in the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, which is close to where I'm from. So I thought it was interesting to put in. One of the other types of records that we use a great deal are church records. And but I wanted to share with you, I told you a little bit about our church records that we have here, but North Carolina as a whole has some other great repositories. Wake Forest University, that's in Winston-Salem, keeps the Baptist church records of North Carolina, including Southern Baptist, Missionary Baptist, Primitive Baptist, African American Baptist, the Women's Missionary Union. So if your family has any connections with the Baptist Church in North Carolina, this would be a good place excuse me, to look. They do have some of the records actually online, and others they will tell you that they have the microfilm and that you might be able to access at some point. But some of them are actually online, and you can look at them. This is just showing you what one of the churches, so Abbott's Creek Primitive Baptist Church, which is fairly close to Rowan or to Salisbury, has this particular church. Guilford College, which is in Greensboro and it's a Quaker school, and it's a sister school to the college that I went to, Earlham College in Indiana. But Guilford College is the Quaker archives for this area. So if your family were Quakers at all, they have completely different records. They kept separate marriage records, and if you're very fortunate, you can find how the meeting records were kept from fairly early on. The Quaker records go back, and they even sometimes will tell you when there were transfers. A lot of Quakers from North Carolina actually eventually end up in Indiana. And many of them left just before and during the Civil War because they objected to slavery in general. But this would be a great place. I do have some Quaker records here, but this would be a good place to look if you're a Quaker connected. We do also have a couple pastors that we have records. As you can see, this particular record is in German. But if you know a few German words, you can usually recognize the names, and so you can figure out that Pastor Stork buried Jacob Bieber on the 30th of April. But anyway, these are some really, really great records as well. And Samuel Rothrock's diaries I showed an example of before. So these are wonderful for baptisms, funerals, and just kind of how people went about their life. He talks about preaching, and he talks about, assisting a widow with her chopping her trees and helping in the tan yard, and all kinds of different activities that he participated in. Now, the last little bit that I'd like to tell you about is, of course, newspapers can be a wonderful resource for things. And if you don't know about it, you should. Chronicling America, of course, has the Library of Congress is chronicling all the very earliest newspapers, and several of the North Carolina newspapers are among that collection. But North Carolina has very few very few newspapers that were in the 1700s, and they're mostly on the East Coast, New Bern, Edenton, Fayetteville, over there. But in the early 1800s and the 1830s, there were two papers that were published here in Salisbury, the Carolina Watchman and the Western Carolinian. They were published in Salisbury, but they covered a great part of Western North Carolina. So they're really good resources to see what people were interested in, what advertisements there might be. Of course, the earlier newspapers have less about families, but still sometimes you will find a marriage announced or a death announced and those kinds of things. But I wanted to tell you about this. Digital NC is a website that's it's free access, and the link is here. But they have probably the most navigable representation of the Carolina Watchman and the Western Carolinian and several other newspapers in North Carolina. But you can kind of, most of these early newspapers were published as weeklies and in four pages. And you can see what years they have. And of course, 1865, not much was printed around here because of the war. But you can go to those and read the papers. But that's a great resource for being able to access these newspapers online. I do have these newspapers here at the library on microfilm, but that doesn't help you when you're in Nevada and you cannot get here. So those are the highlights. There's a lot of other things, of course, that we have here in the library, but I think I'm at time here, and I'd be happy to look at the chat box and try and answer any questions there. Let me start at the top and see if make sure that I can try and answer anybody's questions. Sorry, I'm going through, I start at the top and I'm going through all the other information. Let's see here. Okay, Patty asks, was there a waiting period for the duration of a marriage bond? No, that was one of the things. There wasn't a waiting period. So one of the things that you could do, instead of getting a bond, you could proclaim bans in the church. So or any kind of public gathering. You could declare for 3 successive Sundays that you wanted to get married, and if there was no impediment to the marriage, then you went ahead and you could get married anytime after that third time. But with a bond, you could get married that day or the next day, so there wasn't a waiting period. Quit rents. Oh, that's a good question, and one I'm not completely qualified to answer. But a quit rent is kind of like maybe a rent to own sort of situation where you own the land, but the person who sold you the land could still essentially make you rent parts of it. I'm not explaining that very well. Quit rents are confusing. I will see if I can think of a better way to Okay. April asks about records she didn't know existed. Cohabitation bonds, General Assembly divorces, and bastardy bonds were cohabitation bonds are were throughout, actually they were throughout the Southeast, but not everybody kept them. So there are some other counties that kept their cohabitation bonds. Rowan County is one of them. If you have any access to the African American Heritage website, which we subscribe to here at the library, and you can take a look at it. It shows you, it shows you the cohabitation bonds in which counties. I think there are probably about 15 counties in North Carolina that have those records, but it was not just in Rowan, but in other counties as well. The General Assembly, the divorces for the General Assembly were definitely statewide, because you had the General Assembly was the state legislative branch, essentially. So they you had to take your divorce, no matter where you were from in North Carolina, and go to the General Assembly, and they had to vote on it as a legislative branch to see. And it wasn't until later on that they were relegated to the county courts. Bastardy bonds were also not just in Rowan and not just in North Carolina. There are other places where you would be able to find them. So yeah, they're very interesting records, definitely. And yes, some of them are kept at the archives. They would have records of those, all of those things, the divorces, the cohabitation bonds, and the bastardy bonds. As far as I know, the transcribed deed books are not available digitally. They are still under copyright. The militia rules, same for all states. They were, I think, similar in most states. I mean, basically the rules about the age was specific to, was specific to North Carolina, but similar to all the other colonies. So you have, 16-year-old boys were eligible for militia service, and that was true, I think, throughout the colonies. And then you served until you could be called up until you were 60. I mean, essentially, this was the defense of the local area. So it may have worked slightly differently, and certainly, would probably depend. Some places, the captains of the militia groups were appointed by the court. Sometimes they were chosen by the other men in the district that served under the captain. So some of those might be variable. The table of the bounty land reference is not included on the handout, but if you would like to email me, I'll be happy to send you a copy of it.
Okay, I think that's the end in the chat box, unless you see any others, but I have a few questions myself.
Sure.
And I'd like to encourage the class to put in the chat box any other questions you might have. But I have a question. Something struck me when you were doing your presentation. Yeah. Excuse me. You talked about your Bible collection. Now, was that in your library, or was that only in the state archives?
Oh, the Bible, well, the Bible collection that I talked about, the one that's a digital one, is in the state archives. But we do, in fact, have several Bibles here, and sometimes people will come in and give us will let us scan the family pages in family Bibles. You know how a lot of times in the middle of a Bible, there's an area to write down, the marriage and children born and baptisms and deaths and that kind of thing. And a lot of people will bring those in. So we have a few Bibles here, and some other scanned copies of other families.
Thank you.
kind of answer that question? Okay.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I have another question. You
Mhm.
were talking about meets and bounds. Do you know what year, or at least approximate what year, that your state switched over from meets and bounds to the federal land standard?
Oh, they don't. They're still surveyed. I mean, it's really it's because the federal land, the way the federal lands, and they did this in in New England also. I mean, even early in the 1600s, they portioned out the land in essentially squares, so that you could latitude and longitude lines. You could say, okay, you've got you know the 12th quadrant of the southeast corner of whatever, kind of thing. But in North Carolina, still, you have to describe the land. It's um, it's more, you can still get um, strange looking shapes of land. So we have to have it surveyed. If you can have pie-shaped parts of land and that kind of thing. So that's a good question, though. I'm not entirely sure. I deal so much with 17 and 1800s that I'm not sure when it would have switched over to a more what most people would think a logical. But we get people. Rowan County was very fortunate in that they never had a courthouse. We never had a burned courthouse, so no significant record loss here, which is unusual in the South, the Southeast particularly. So we have retained so many of our land records and all, a lot of other records, that lots of people from all over the country can trace their family here, particularly since we were the western frontier. Lots of people came through this area before they went west to Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Indiana, and then further out. So we get lots of people coming to look for their families, and I have to explain the meets and bounds a lot because in Indiana, where I grew up, everything's in a square. You you know where the land is by latitude and longitude, but in North Carolina, you have to, it's not so much the post oak anymore to the black oak to the hickory tree, but it's definitely usually more complicated because of and people will come in and say, oh well, can you tell me where my ancestors' land was? And that can be complicated to answer that question because you have to backtrack the land essentially to figure out where it was initially. We do have, and I didn't really include it because I figured we were going to run out of time, but we do have on our website Rowan, the early settlers of Rowan County, and it's a map of Rowan County, and it shows where the earliest land deeds and the shape of the land. It shows where they are in what is currently Rowan County. So if anybody has a family that they can track back here, they might want to take a look at that map because that will give them a better idea of where the land was initially.
Great explanation. Okay, Connie wants to know through the chat box, going back to the family Bibles, are they scanned online, or do you have to actually physically go there to see them?
The ones at the archives are online.
And what about the ones you have?
The ones that I have are not online, but could eventually be online. Yeah, we are trying to digitize our some of our collections, and it just takes a while to get everything up, and online and be able to be visible and that kind of thing. So.
And Jill wanted to remind everyone that she does her North Carolina research on a website called MARS, M-A-R-S.
Actually, it's Mars is actually not the website itself. It's the archives, but it's the search engine that they use and the classification. It is really complicated to use. I find it frustrating myself. So the archives website has changed a good bit. Mars is still available, but there are things that are on the North Carolina Archives website that are more easily navigable than they used to be. So certainly worth a look.
Great. Now, you mentioned earlier in your presentation about Earl Granville and how he was granted a charter. For the
Right.
benefit of the people in my class who are, absolute beginners, could you kind of explain a charter to them?
Okay, well, I mean, essentially the King of England decided he was going to give his friends part of the New World. That was all. I mean, basically, in his mind, everything over here belonged to him, and he could parcel it out the way he wanted to. So he essentially they took, a line and drew it all the way to the Western Waters, which is the Pacific, but no one had actually surveyed that far. So realistically, it was really only to the Mississippi River. But and he gave that land to those folks to do with whatever they wanted to, essentially. Although many people knew that they were probably going to sell a good bit of it. So that's none of the Lords Proprietor ever came to see the land or knew much about it other than it was, profitable for them or potentially profitable for them. Does that kind of explain?
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Okay.
Also, I wanted to remind everybody in the class, since you mentioned Fold 3, regarding pension records and such.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to remind everyone that we do have access to Fold 3 on a temporary basis because our library just got a trial to it. So if I announced that last week in class, so if you missed class last week, just contact me for the username and password, and I'll be more than happy to email it to you. All we ask is that you just don't put it on the internet. And then also, let's see here. I wonder, you touched on something that was just really to me very fascinating, the pastor diaries.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking that in some cases that may be the only reference to someone's death.
That is true. That is very true. Because a lot of these, a lot of folks would be poor farmers, and they wouldn't have, had any land, or if they had any property, it just went to their children, and nobody, they didn't actually have to go to court. And for a land transfer, if the transfer was in the family, they didn't ever have to go to court. So, yeah, there weren't very many reasons why anyone would know specifically when someone died. So yes, it's the pastor's diaries can be great. And one of the things about early churches is that the churches themselves didn't always keep the records. The pastors did. And sometimes the pastors moved on to a different church and took the records with them. So the fact that, like with Pastor Rothrock, Samuel Rothrock, he was a pastor in Rowan County and also in Cabarrus County, which is just south of us. But he pastored like 5 or 6 different churches, although two of them mainly, during the time that he was here, basically from 1832 up to he passed away in 1890s. So, I mean, yes, it's a wonderful, a plethora of records that we wouldn't have if we didn't have his diaries. There, I mean, not only deaths, but marriages too, because, you could proclaim bans in a church, never have to get a civil bond, never have to, there wasn't any reason necessarily for anyone to know about a marriage either,
Yeah, when you mentioned that, I was thinking, oh my gosh, what a great, I mean, because we all think about, looking for, like you said, for bonds or for church records, but how many of us think about pastor records or priest records,
yeah.
Individual records, personal records or memoirs and such. I mean, that's a diary. I mean, wow, that's beautiful. And then let's see here. Lastly, my last question is, what digital references services can my students use when they reach out to you?
There are the McCubbin's Index, which is online and totally, accessible to you guys. We also have the library here, has we have digital library cards, and we do not require residency. So if you would like to use, the databases that we have online, you can get an online library card and use those databases.
Wow. I hope everyone in my class that's still logged on understands the value of that. Yeah. I know I'm going to log in right after it's over today and apply for mine right away.
Because we do have full 3. And African American Heritage and Heritage Quest. We also have NorthCarolinaNewspapers.com, just historic North Carolina newspapers available, but that still can be very helpful. Now, we are working on the Salisbury Post is the newspaper in town that's been here since been publishing since 1905, and we are working on digitizing that. That's one of our big projects, is digitizing that newspaper and making it available for people. We do have the McCubbins files, which are surname files, and very, very lengthy, in-depth. Mrs. McCubbins did research for decades. She was connected to a lot of the Rowan families, the old families, and she worked for the WPA, and her husband was clerk of court, so she had access to all kinds of things. So she did a lot of research, as I said, about 3 or so decades. When she passed away in 1954, we inherited all her papers, like 150,000 plus pieces of paper about Rowan County families. And so we've digitized all of those, and those are available online. So that's a really great place to start.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, you got my students' attention. They want to know, what website do they go to get the library card?
Yes, Rowan Public Library. Yeah, did I not? I must not have included that, but here, let me see if I can put it in the chat box.
Or if you want, you can just switch it over on your shared desktop,
okay.
and then it'll get recorded, so they can have it. They can go back and refer to it.
Okay. Let me see. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. All of a sudden it got really quiet, and I wasn't sure if I had for some reason lost you. Okay, I'm stopping the share, and I will see if I can.
And then while you're doing that, we had another question come in. They want to know, what churches did German immigrants follow or attend?
For the most part, they were Lutheran here or German Reformed. Okay. So can you? Okay, I need to share my screen again, right? Okay, this is what the Rowan Public Library webpage looks like. It's rowancounty.nc.gov, or you can just type in rowanpubliclibrary.org and you'll get it. But don't put in county. It's Rowan Public Library. If you put Rowan County Public Library, you'll get Rowan County in Kentucky, which is not what you want.
Wonderful.
And yeah. So here's the history and genealogy. And so these are all our database links that you can see. And I can scroll down here. This is Mrs. McCubbin's index. So if you click on there, then you can, there are all these links to PDF files essentially. So say you were looking for, I don't know, anybody want to say a name?
Bartlett.
Bartlett? Okay. Let's see if I've got a Bartlett. Yep. So it shows you this, and then you would, I find it easier to to download the page, and then you can, now these are searchable, so they've been OCR'd, but she hand wrote a lot of them. So OCR doesn't work very well on that. So you have Josiah Bartlett, who's Sons of the American Revolution, and, you know, she has a lot of these that, you know, can connect to the,
Wonderful.
Yeah, but these can be very helpful, and a lot of times she'll have names that I'm having trouble getting to the, yeah.
And then Jan wants to know in the chat box, on the online library card application, one question asks for desired home location. Which should we choose in the drop down?
I'd choose headquarters, but it doesn't really matter much.
Okay.
But I hope that's, oh, I was telling you about the maps. So I could why is it that things don't always work when you want them to, right? Oh, we also have, like, we do have some digital exhibits, and so those are available. We also have, with a professor at Catawba College, the history professor, Dr. Gary Fries, and I did some videos about the history of Rowan County, and they are available on our website, on YouTube. Essentially, it takes you to YouTube, but it's called A Ramble Through Rowan's History, and they're, you know, tells you a little bit about the history of Rowan County in we essentially made them for, in North Carolina, children study North Carolina history in 4th grade and in 8th grade, and we made them so that the kids could use them in their classes, you know, to write essays and things like that. So but that might be another thing to take a look at. We did a Spanish influenza program at the beginning of the epidemic. We also have a collection of postcards. There was a German immigrant that came here, and he took a lot of photographs and sent them back to Germany to have postcards made. But there's a lot of history and visual of Rowan County, and particularly Salisbury. The Klutz maps is what I was telling you about, the early settlers of and you can it's basically a 5-piece set, but you can look up by family name. So say I want to look up somebody whose last name starts with H, and so Earnhardt's, anybody a racing fan might know the Earnhardts. They've been here for a long time in this area, and so if you find, okay, your person is Elias Earnhardt, and you click on 6B1, it will pull up the map of where his land was. And this information here on the, well, Elias doesn't have it, unfortunately, but he must have been just adjacent to people. But you see these, the numbers here where it says 10-328, this, and north, it says NC Frederick Fisher. That means Frederick Fisher bought it from the state of North Carolina So it was a grant from North Carolina to Frederick Fisher in 1784. You can find it in Deed Book 10, page 328. And then he sold it to Mary Broner in 1818, and that's Deed Book 26. But this map can give you a lot of information as well on land records if that's something that you're interested in pursuing.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really impressive.
Thank you. So yeah, any other questions?
No, it looks like that's it. I just have one. I always kind of like to ask when I have other librarians presenting, just
Sure.
Librarian to librarian. I always kind of like to ask, who is your typical patron, both pre COVID-19 and post COVID-19? Is there like a typical genealogy patron?
No, I don't think there really is. I mean, we get all kinds of people that come up here. I helped one lady one time. She was, and for different reasons, people look for their genealogy for different reasons. There was, people come up and saying, oh, we're going to have a family, reunion, and I want to know more about the family so I can tell everybody at the reunion. Or one gal that I helped, probably 8 years ago now, but it was very interesting helping her because she was part Native American, and the tribe that she was associated with went back and forth from northeast United States to Canada. And so some of the records were Canadian records, French Canadian Catholic records, and some of them were North, Maine and that kind of thing. But she was tracking a very specific disease that some members of her family had, and the reasons why they might have had that. So it was a really for her, the genealogy study was particularly for the family's health interest. So you just get all kinds of interesting folks. We get people doing genealogy tracking heirs if they're they have somebody that or an estate that hasn't been settled because they can't find any heirs, or they know there are heirs but they can't find them in particular. So that's always interesting. I've had I've helped the sheriff's department with some genealogy, so it's very interesting, and you get all kinds of interesting folks that come up.
Well, I'm just honored and thrilled that you were able to share your expertise today with not only myself, but with the class as well. And I'm very excited about the information that you shared, and I hope every one of them puts it to use this next week. And definitely, once again, I encourage everyone to get a library card.
Yes, definitely.
So what a wonderful benefit your library allows your out-of-state patrons to enjoy.
Yeah. And and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to. I'll try and answer as quickly as I can, but we'll.
Okay, wonderful. Well, okay, I'll go ahead and say thank you very, very much for a very enlightening webinar, and I'll be in touch with you soon. And I'll go ahead and just wave. I don't know if you can see me, but
I can. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll go ahead and sign off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.